Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of Karyn Kupcinet and the heavy silence that fell upon apartment 306. It is late November in the year 1963. The world feels fragile, held together by the collective mourning of a nation that lost its president only 8 days prior. In the sun-drenched sprawl of West Hollywood, the usual glimmer of the film industry has been replaced by a somber, muted gray. The air is cooling as autumn settles into the canyons, and the palm trees cast long, skeletal shadows across the pavement of North Sweetser Avenue. Here, within the Monterey Village apartment complex, a story is unfolding that will remain etched in the darker corners of Hollywood lore. We are moving through a time of deep uncertainty, where every creak of a floorboard feels like a question, and every unlit window holds a secret. The Monterey Village is a place of mid-century charm, a collection of units designed for those chasing the flickering light of fame. It is a place of white stucco and wrought iron, where the scent of jasmine often mingles with the exhaust of passing cars. But on this Saturday, the 30th of November, the atmosphere is different. There is a stillness here that feels intentional, almost heavy. Karyn Kupcinet, a 22-year-old actress with wide eyes and a future that seemed to be ripening, has not been seen for days. Her friends, the actor Mark Goddard and his wife Marcia, have been gripped by a persistent, nagging worry. It is that specific kind of dread that starts small in the pit of the stomach and grows until it cannot be ignored. They had expected a phone call that never came. They had expected a presence that has suddenly become a void. As they pull their car to the curb and look up at the windows of the third floor, the silence of the building seems to reach out to meet them. Mark and Marcia walk toward the entrance, their footsteps echoing softly against the concrete. The lobby is quiet, the air inside the building carrying the faint, dusty smell of old carpets and floor wax. They take the elevator up to the third floor, the mechanical hum of the lift feeling loud and intrusive in the quiet afternoon. When the doors slide open, the hallway stretches out before them, illuminated by a few dim yellow lights. It is a mundane setting for the beginning of a tragedy. They reach the door marked 306. Mark hesitates for a heartbeat, his hand hovering near the wood. He knocks, a sharp, rhythmic sound that receives no answer. He tries the handle, expecting it to be locked, expecting to have to find a manager or a key. But the knob turns. The door is unlocked, yielding to his touch with a soft, effortless glide. It is an invitation into a space where time has seemingly stopped. As the door swings inward, the first thing they notice is the light. The curtains are drawn, but the blue, flickering glow of a television set fills the living room with a ghostly, rhythmic pulse. The volume has been turned down so low it is almost a whisper, a mechanical murmur that does nothing to break the stillness. The apartment is warm, the air thick and stagnant, carrying a faint, unrecognizable sweetness that makes the breath hitch. On the coffee table, there are remnants of a life in motion. Stray cigarette butts in an amber glass ashtray, a scattering of prescription bottles with labels like Desoxin and Miltone, and an open book. It is a scene that looks, at a glance, like a quiet evening interrupted. But then, their eyes settle on the couch. There, lying face down, is Karyn. She is nude, her pale skin contrasting sharply against the dark fabric of the sofa. She looks as though she has simply fallen into a deep, dreamless sleep while watching the late-night broadcasts. They move closer, the floorboards groaning under their weight. Mark reaches out, perhaps hoping to wake her, perhaps still believing that this is just the result of too many pills and too much exhaustion. But as he nears the couch, the reality of the situation settles over him like a cold shroud. The stillness of her body is absolute. There is no rising and falling of the chest, no soft breath escaping her lips. The room, once a sanctuary for a young woman's dreams, has become a vault. The flickering light from the television dances across the walls, casting distorted shadows that seem to move even though everything else is frozen. Marcia gasps, the sound sharp and crystalline in the small space. They realize then that they are not just looking at a friend who has passed out, they are looking at a crime scene. The absence of forced entry makes the scene even more haunting. It suggests that she had let someone in, or perhaps, that someone had never truly left. The details begin to sharpen as they wait for the authorities. They notice the way her head is turned, the specific angle of her limbs. There is a sense of profound loneliness in the room, a quietude that feels heavy and permanent. The busy streets of West Hollywood continue to hum outside the window, oblivious to the fact that within these four walls, a life has been extinguished in the most intimate of ways. This was the daughter of Karyn Kupcinet, the famous Chicago columnist, a girl who had grown up in the spotlight only to find herself alone in the dark of apartment 306. As the police sirens begin to wail in the distance, cutting through the afternoon air, the mystery of Karyn's final moments begins to take root. Was it an accident, a tragic slip into the void caused by the very substances meant to keep her thin and beautiful? Or was there a hand in the shadows, a silent visitor who walked through that unlocked door and took her breath away? For now, we remain in the silence, watching the television flicker as the world outside prepares to learn her name in a way they never expected. Before the silence in that West Hollywood apartment became absolute, there was the vibrant, rhythmic pulse of a life lived in the spotlight. To understand the stillness of that room on North Sweetser Avenue, we must travel back across the country, away from the dry heat of California and into the brisk, limestone-scented air of Chicago in the 1950s. In the heart of the city, the name Kupcinet carried a weight that few others could match. Karyn Kupcinet, known affectionately to the world as Kup, was the king of the Chicago Sun-Times. His column was a daily feast of gossip, politics, and celebrity, read by millions and feared by those with secrets to hide. He was a man who moved between the mahogany-paneled offices of mayors and the smoke-filled jazz clubs where the famous came to play. This was the world that shaped the young woman on the couch, a world where importance was measured by the frequency of one's name in newsprint. She was born Roberta Lynn Kupcinet on March 6, 1941. To her family and the inner circle of Chicago's elite, she was simply Cookie, a darling, dark-haired child who lived in a sprawling 9-room apartment on the Gold Coast, overlooking the steel-blue expanse of Lake Michigan. From the very beginning, the expectations placed upon her were as heavy as the winter coats worn on Michigan Avenue. Her mother, Essie, was a woman of fierce ambition who had once dreamed of the stage herself, only to have those dreams curtailed by the traditions of her era. Essie saw in her daughter a second chance, a vessel for the stardom she had never quite grasped. At the tender age of only 5 months, Cookie was already working, her tiny face appearing in advertisements for baby clothes. By the time she could walk, she was being groomed for a life of performance, navigating the delicate balance between being a beloved daughter and a rising product of the Kupcinet legacy. As the years turned, the young girl matured within the prestigious walls of the Francis W. Parker School, where she participated in theater with a hunger that was both natural and carefully nurtured. But the Gold Coast, for all its luxury, felt like a gilded cage. By the time she reached her late teens, Roberta began to shed the skin of her childhood. She briefly attended Pine Manor College in the East, but the pull of the spotlight was too strong to resist. She moved to New York City to study at the famed Actors Studio, immersing herself in the method, learning under the watchful eyes of legends like Lee Strasberg. It was during this time that Roberta Lynn officially became Karyn. The name was sharper, more modern, a deliberate step away from the softness of Cookie. She wanted to be seen not just as a columnist's daughter, but as a serious artist, a woman capable of commanding a stage on her own merits. In 1960, at the age of 19, Karyn made the pivot that so many young hopefuls did during that golden era of television. She headed west to Hollywood. The transition was jarring. Chicago was a city of stone and industry, of deep roots and family names that echoed through the decades. Hollywood was a city of shifting sands, of neon and palm trees, where a person's value could change with the morning ratings. Initially, the Kupcinet name did open doors. She landed a small speaking part in a film directed by Jerry Lewis called The Ladies' Man, and she soon became a familiar face in the living rooms of America. She appeared in guest roles on beloved programs like The Andy Griffith Show, Death Valley Days, and Perry Mason. For a time, it seemed the dream was manifesting exactly as her mother had envisioned. She was a regular on the Gertrude Berg Show, playing a bright young student, her face lit by the warm, forgiving glow of the studio cameras. Yet, beneath the glossy surface of her Hollywood life, the pressures were beginning to take a quiet, corrosive toll. To be a young actress in the early 1960s was to be under constant, unforgiving surveillance. Karyn was frequently interviewed about her diet, her weight, and her beauty routines. The industry demanded a certain fragile thinness, a look that Karyn struggled to maintain. It was a struggle that had begun years earlier in Chicago, when her mother first introduced her to diet pills to keep her figure trim for modeling. In the lonely stretches between filming, Karyn turned more and more to these small, colored tablets to manage her appetite and her mounting anxieties. She underwent plastic surgery to refine her features, constantly chasing a standard of perfection that felt forever out of reach. The vibrant, laughing girl from the Gold Coast was slowly being replaced by a woman who felt she was perpetually performing, even when the cameras were dark. By 1963, Karyn had settled into the Monterey Village apartment complex on North Sweetser Avenue. It was a stylish place, once home to stars like Cary Grant, and it felt like the perfect backdrop for a rising starlet. She was 22 years old, beautiful, and seemingly on the cusp of true success. She was also deeply enmeshed in a complicated relationship with an actor named Andrew Prine, a romance that oscillated between intense passion and painful distance. As she walked the sun-drenched streets of West Hollywood, Karyn carried with her the hopes of her father, the ambitions of her mother, and the growing weight of her own secrets. She was no longer just the daughter of Chicago. She was a woman alone in a city of dreams, unaware that the shadows were lengthening around her, and that the story which began in the prestigious corridors of the Midwest was drawing toward a sudden, silent conclusion. The Hollywood of 1963 was a landscape of extreme contrasts, where the blinding white glare of the studio lights created shadows that were unnaturally long and impossibly deep. For a young woman like Karyn Kupcinet, those shadows were not just physical. They were the invisible weight of a legacy she carried from the windy streets of Chicago all the way to the palm-fringed boulevards of Los Angeles. To the public, she was the beautiful daughter of Irv Kupcinet, the legendary columnist whose words could make or break a career with a single paragraph in the Sun-Times. To the industry, she was a promising starlet with a famous name. But inside the quiet rooms of her Monterey Village apartment, Karyn was simply a 22-year-old woman trying to find a version of herself that didn't belong to her father's readers or her mother's unfulfilled dreams. Growing up in Chicago, Karyn, known affectionately as Cookie, had lived a life of immense privilege and even greater pressure. Her father, Irv, was more than a journalist. He was an institution, a man who mingled with presidents and kings of the underworld alike. Her mother, Esther, known as Essie, had once been a dancer whose own ambitions were cut short by the strict expectations of her family. Essie poured every ounce of that redirected energy into Karyn, grooming her for the spotlight before she could even read a script. By the age of 5 months, Karyn was already modeling baby clothes. By the time she was a teenager, she was being pushed toward a perfection that felt increasingly out of reach. It was an environment where the love was vast, but the conditions were rigid. And the heaviest condition of all was the requirement to remain perpetually beautiful, thin, and successful. In the early 1960s, Karyn began to make her mark on the television screen, though the roles were often fleeting. She appeared in the sitcom titled The Gertrude Berg Show, playing a student named Carol. On set, she was professional and bright, moving through the artificial living rooms of the soundstage with a grace that masked her internal exhaustion. She spent hours under the hot, buzzing lamps of the studio, the smell of heavy grease paint and hairspray lingering in her nostrils long after she drove home. She secured guest spots on popular programs like The Andy Griffith Show and Death Valley Days, and she even appeared in the Jerry Lewis film, The Ladies' Man. Yet, despite these victories, Karyn felt a persistent, gnawing sense of fraudulence. She chafed at the suspicion that directors and producers were only kind to her because they feared a bad review in her father's column. She wanted to be seen, truly seen, for her own talent, but the heavy shadow of the Kupcinet name always seemed to precede her into the room. To satisfy the demanding eye of the camera, and perhaps the even more demanding eye of her mother, Karyn underwent a series of physical transformations. By the time she was 20, she had already sought out plastic surgery to alter the shape of her nose, her ears, and her chin. But the most dangerous transformation was the one happening inside her medicine cabinet. The pressure to stay thin in an industry that worshipped frailty led her toward prescription diet pills like Disoxin and Preludin. These were not the gentle supplements of a later era. They were powerful amphetamines that kept her heart racing and her mind vibrating with a nervous, jittery energy. The pills offered a false sense of control, a chemical shield against the creeping feeling that she was never quite enough. In the bright lights of the studio, she looked like a quintessential Hollywood dream, but the chemical shadows were beginning to stretch across her sanity, making the nights longer and the silence of her apartment much louder. In the quiet hours of 1963, when the television went to static and the traffic on North Sweetser Avenue thinned to a whisper, Karyn would often sit alone, surrounded by the scripts of roles she hoped would finally change everything. She was a woman caught between two worlds, the high society of Chicago where she was a princess, and the gritty competition of Hollywood where she was just another face in a casting office. She kept a diary that spoke of her disillusionment, describing Tinseltown as a place of phony motives and selfish egoists. She was searching for something solid, something real that wasn't tied to a press release or a gossip item. This search for connection eventually led her to a tall, charismatic actor named Andrew Prine, a man who would become the center of her world, and ultimately, a central figure in the mystery of her final days. As the months of 1963 marched toward November, the tension in Karyn's life reached a fever pitch. Her relationship with Andrew was volatile, her use of prescription drugs was escalating, and the letters from Chicago continued to remind her of the high stakes of her success. She was a young woman dancing on a wire, trying to balance the bright, public image of a starlet with the heavy, private shadows of her own insecurities. The Monterey Village apartment, with its stylish furniture and its proximity to the stars, was becoming less of a sanctuary and more of a stage where the final act of her life was beginning to take shape. She was only 22, but she was already carrying the weariness of a lifetime spent under the scrutiny of 1,000 eyes. The lights were shimmering, the cameras were rolling, but the shadows were closing in, preparing to swallow the girl they called Cookie forever. The late autumn of 1963 was a season of profound silence. Only 5 days had passed since the tragedy in Dallas, and the nation was paralyzed by a grief that seemed to stall time itself. In Hollywood, the glitz was replaced by a somber atmosphere. Karyn Kupcinet, a 22-year-old actress with a name carrying the weight of her father's legacy, moved through this world like a ghost. She was physically fragile, her mind clouded by prescription pills and the strain of a failing romance. On the evening of Wednesday, November 27th, as the city prepared for a muted Thanksgiving, Karyn's personal timeline began its final descent. She dressed for dinner with the Goddards, her movements sluggish, her focus fractured by a world that felt as though it were coming apart at the seams. She arrived at the Goddard home more than an hour late, stepping from a taxicab with a hollow look in her eyes. It was roughly 7:30. During the meal, Mark and Marcia observed a version of Karyn they had never seen. She didn't eat. She toyed with her food, moving utensils in rhythmic, meaningless patterns. Her voice was thin, and her lips seemed numb, as if speaking was a labor. Her pupils were constricted, a sign of the chemicals in her system. She shared a bizarre story about finding an abandoned baby on her doorstep, a claim later proven false. By 8:30, she was back in a taxi, promising to call her friends, unaware her life was growing thin. Karyn returned to her apartment at 1244 North Hayworth. Two friends, Edward Stephen Rubin and Robert Hathaway, dropped by to keep her company. The three settled into the living room, the flickering blue light of the television providing the only illumination. They watched the Danny Kaye Show, a program of laughter that must have felt surreal in the quiet of that night. Karyn, exhausted, eventually drifted into a shallow sleep on the couch. Rubin and Hathaway stayed for a while, the hum of the television filling the gaps in their conversation. Around 11:15, seeing she was resting, they decided to leave. They locked the door behind them, an act that would later become a focal point of the investigation. The night air was crisp as they walked away from the silent building. As the clock struck midnight, ushering in Thanksgiving Day, the telephone rang. It was Andrew Prine. Despite the turbulence of their relationship, he was calling to check on her. During this conversation, Karyn repeated the strange story of the abandoned baby, her voice drifting across the wire in the dark. This was the last time anyone would hear her alive. What followed was a period of absolute, terrifying silence. While the rest of the country slept, Karyn was alone in the quiet of West Hollywood. The air was still, the only sound the faint ticking of a clock. In this window, the shadow stalking her finally entered the room. There were no signs of a struggle, just the heavy, soundless weight of an impending tragedy. The forensic window placed her death shortly after that midnight call, around 12:30 in the morning on Thursday. The cause was a violent but whisper-quiet act, manual strangulation. A bone in her neck, the hyoid, was fractured, a sign of immense pressure. There were no screams, just a transition from the frantic energy of her final days into a cold stillness. As the sun rose on Thanksgiving Day, Karyn lay on her couch, the television still playing to an empty room. Outside, families gathered for dinner, the smell of roasting turkey floating through the courtyard. Karyn's absence was noted, but in the fog of that week, many assumed she was simply grieving or sleeping. The holiday passed in a blur of ignored phone calls and unanswered knocks. Friday came and went, and the silence from apartment number 104 deepened. The telephone rang persistently, its trill echoing off the walls. It wasn't until Saturday evening, November 30th, that the Goddards, overcome by dread, returned to the building. The sun was setting, casting amber shadows as they climbed the stairs. They found the door unlocked, a chilling departure from the night she was last seen. Inside, the apartment was a tomb. The air was heavy with the scent of stale coffee. Karyn was there, but she was gone, her body a silent testament to a mystery that would defy solution for decades. The timeline of her life had ended, but the legend of that weekend was only just beginning. The shadows of Hollywood had claimed another soul. The air inside the Monterey Village courtyard was unusually still for a Saturday evening in late November, 1963. Mark Goddard stood outside apartment number 104, his hand poised to knock. The silence from within was heavy, a dense curtain that seemed to dampen the usual sounds of West Hollywood. When he finally reached for the handle, he found that the door was not just unlocked, but slightly ajar, yielding to the lightest pressure. It swung inward with a slow, rhythmic creak that felt loud in the breathless hallway. As the door opened, the first thing to meet him was not a sound, but a glow. The living room was bathed in the flickering, cool blue light of a television set that had been left running for days. The volume was turned down so low it was merely a rhythmic vibration, a ghostly hum that seemed to mimic a heartbeat. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned chairs or shattered glass. Instead, there was a sense of frozen time, as if the room had been preserved in the middle of a mundane, lonely evening. Mark and his wife, Marcia, stepped further into the room, their eyes adjusting to the dim, artificial twilight. The apartment was a small, modest space, yet it felt cavernous in its emptiness. On the coffee table, the remnants of a life in flux were scattered with a chilling lack of order. There were several coffee cups, some with dark, dried rings at the bottom, and a television dinner tray that sat untouched, its contents cold and congealed. Most striking were the cigarettes. Dozens of butts were strewn across the table and the floor, as if someone had been pacing or sitting in a state of high agitation. Some of the filtered ends were stained with a pale shade of lipstick, while others were clean. The air carried the faint, stale scent of tobacco smoke and the metallic tang of a space that had been closed off from the world. It was a scene of deep isolation, the kind that settles into the walls when a person has withdrawn from the light of the sun. As they moved toward the center of the room, they saw her. Karyn was lying on the long, low couch, her body positioned face down in a way that looked almost like a deep, exhausted sleep. She was entirely nude, her pale skin contrasting sharply against the dark fabric of the sofa. There was a terrible, unnatural stillness to her form. To the Goddards, it appeared at first as though she might have simply succumbed to the weight of her own troubles, perhaps drifting off under the influence of the many prescription bottles that were visible around the room. On a nearby shelf and near the bedside, 13 different containers of medication were found, many of them for disoxin, the powerful diet pills she had been prescribed since she was a young girl. The sight was heartbreaking rather than horrific in that first moment. A portrait of a young woman who had finally found the quiet she had been chasing through the haze of chemicals and Hollywood pressures. The investigators who arrived shortly after would note the peculiar details of the environment. Every window in the apartment was securely locked from the inside, and there were no marks on the door frame to suggest a forced entry. The apartment was a fortress of sorts, which made the discovery of her body all the more puzzling. If she had been alone, why was the door left unlocked? If she had invited someone in, who could have sat with her in this small space without leaving a more chaotic footprint? On the table, nestled among the debris of the evening, sat a book. It was open to a specific page that described the act of dancing in the nude to free one's inhibitions, a detail that would later lead to many strange theories about her final moments. There was also a note, written in a frantic, looping hand, where Karyn had poured out her insecurities about her weight, her beauty, and her desperate love for Andrew. It was as if the room itself was a physical manifestation of her internal monologue, cluttered, anxious, and deeply sad. The lack of obvious violence at the scene was deceptive. There was no blood, no signs of a desperate fight for life. The bathroom was neat, with a damp towel suggesting she might have showered recently before she died. Investigators found her clothing neatly folded in the other room, further supporting the idea that she had been preparing for bed or perhaps felt comfortable enough in her own home to remain unclothed. It was only when the coroner began his closer examination that the subtle, dark truth of the room began to emerge. Beneath the surface of this seemingly peaceful scene lay a hidden trauma. The focus shifted from an accidental overdose to something far more sinister. The way she was positioned, the peculiar state of the items on the coffee table, and the 2 separate brands of cigarettes suggested that Karyn might not have been as alone as the locked windows implied. The apartment was a stage where the final act had been performed with a terrifying, quiet precision, leaving behind a silence that was more eloquent than any scream. As the police processed the scene into the early hours of the morning, the blue light of the television continued to flicker against the walls of apartment 104. They moved with careful, deliberate steps, cataloging the strange, threatening notes Karyn had seemingly received. Notes that were later revealed to have been constructed by her own hand, using letters cut from the magazines found in her kitchen. This discovery added a layer of psychological complexity to the physical evidence. The scene was not just a place where a life had ended. It was a sanctuary of a mind that had been unraveling for months. Every object, from the half-empty coffee cups to the scattered ash, told a story of a woman who was living in a state of perpetual fear and self-loathing. The tragedy was etched into the very stillness of the furniture. As the morning sun began to bleed through the curtains, the mystery of how someone could enter and exit this lockdown life without a trace began to settle over West Hollywood like a cold, persistent fog. As the morning of December 1st, 1963, began to break over the Hollywood Hills, the silence in the apartment on North Sweetser Avenue was heavy. The police had finally turned off the television, that steady blue flicker that had been the only companion to Karyn's body for 3 long days. The room, once a stage for a young woman's dreams, was now a grid of chalk and flashbulbs. Outside, the air was crisp, typical for late autumn in California, but inside the Los Angeles County morgue, the climate was different. It was a place of polished steel and porcelain, where the vibrant, troubled life of a 22-year-old girl was reduced to a set of physical coordinates. The transition from the warm, cluttered apartment to the sterile examination table was the first step in a medical mystery that would soon baffle the city. At first, the narrative seemed almost too familiar for the era. A beautiful young actress, found alone, surrounded by the remnants of a life under pressure. On the bedside table and in the medicine cabinet, investigators had counted 13 different containers of prescription medication. There were diet pills like Desoxyn, which Karyn had used since her teenage years to satisfy the industry's demand for a slender frame. And there were tranquilizers like Miltone, used to quiet the jittery nerves those very stimulants produced. The officers on the scene, seeing her lying there so still, had naturally assumed this was a tragic but straightforward case of an accidental overdose, or perhaps a quiet surrender to the weight of it all. It was a story Hollywood had told many times before, a predictable ending to a starlet's struggle. The task of finding the truth fell to the medical examiner, a man named Dr. Harold Cade. The room was quiet, save for the hum of the ventilation and the soft clink of instruments. As he began his work, the initial expectation of a chemical death began to shift. There were no visible wounds on Karyn's body, no defensive cuts on her hands, no deep bruises that shouted of a struggle. She appeared as though she had simply fallen asleep. However, as the doctor moved his focus to the delicate structures of the neck, the silence of the room was punctured by a discovery that changed everything. Underneath the skin, away from the prying eyes of the initial investigators, lay a secret that the chemicals in her blood could not explain. The hyoid bone is a small, horseshoe-shaped structure situated in the anterior midline of the neck, between the chin and the thyroid cartilage. It is a lonely bone, a floating traveler that does not articulate with any other bone in the human skeleton. Instead, it is anchored only by a delicate network of muscles and ligaments, serving as a vital support for the tongue and a gateway for the breath. When Dr. Cade felt the subtle, unnatural give of that bone, the entire direction of the case shifted. In the cold, quiet laboratory, the discovery of a fracture in such a protected place usually speaks of a singular, terrifying pressure. It is the signature of hands, manual strangulation. The snap of that bone was like a thunderclap in the silence of the morgue, instantly transforming a tragic accident into a hunt for a killer. This finding created a profound medical mystery. How could someone be strangled to death without any bruising on the exterior of the neck? There were no ligature marks, no scratches from her own fingernails trying to pull the hands away. It was as if she had been perfectly still during the encounter. This lack of external trauma led to whispered theories and deep confusion. Some wondered if the drug levels in her system had left her so incapacitated that she could not fight back, or if the killer was someone she trusted so completely that she never saw the danger coming. The medical report listed the cause of death as asphyxia due to manual strangulation, turning a private tragedy into a high-profile murder hunt that would capture the attention of the nation. Yet, even the medical evidence was not without its shadows. In the years that followed, the reputation of Dr. Cade would come under scrutiny. There were rumors of his own struggles and whispers that he might have accidentally broken the delicate bone during the autopsy process. A later comment attributed to him, where he allegedly remarked that at least he had not broken the hyoid this time, only fueled the fire of doubt. Crime writers would later suggest Karyn might have fallen against furniture, snapping the bone in an accident. But for the police in 1963, the fractured bone was a definitive sign of murder. The air in West Hollywood during late November of 1963 carried a peculiar weight. It was a season of long shadows, a time when the entire nation felt as though it were holding its breath. For Karyn Kupcinet, the world had become a claustrophobic stage where the lines between her roles and her reality were beginning to blur. We move now from the clinical, cold examination of the medical examiner's office to the cluttered interior of apartment 212. Here, the scent of perfume mingled with the acrid sting of stale cigarettes. On the coffee table lay the remnants of a life in transition, scripts with dog-eared pages and half-empty bottles of diet pills. It was within these walls that the authorities began to piece together a different kind of evidence, not of bone and sinew, but of the heart. At the center of this emotional storm was a young man named Andrew Prine. He was a Hollywood rising star, handsome and 26 years old. They had met on the set of a television series titled The Wide Country in 1962, and the attraction had been immediate. To Karyn, Andrew was more than just a boyfriend. He was a focal point, a sun around which her fragile world orbited. But as the months turned into a year, the gravity of her affection began to feel more like a weight to him. While Karyn spoke of marriage, Andrew was drifting toward the independence of a bachelor's life. The dynamics were classic, but beneath the surface, a darker script was being written. The detectives would soon discover that the vibrant actress known to her family, as Cookie was struggling with a sense of abandonment that no amount of success could soothe. The tension escalated throughout the summer of 1963. There was a secret journey to Tijuana, a somber trip born of necessity, which only seemed to deepen the fracture in their bond. Karyn's reliance on prescription stimulants, specifically a drug called disoxin, grew more pronounced. These little pills promised the slim figure Hollywood demanded, but they delivered a jagged, nervous energy that made sleep a stranger. Her behavior became increasingly erratic. She was known to follow Andrew, sometimes watching his apartment from the safety of a taxi cab, a silent spectator to his life without her. In one instance, she called him with a story about finding an abandoned baby on her doorstep, a desperate plea for his presence that turned out to be fabricated. It was a performance born of a breaking heart, a reaching out for a hand that was already letting go. The most chilling chapter of this broken script involved the anonymous letters. Both Karyn and Andrew had begun receiving strange, threatening notes taped to their doors. These were not handwritten. They were collages of malice, constructed from words and letters cut from the pages of popular magazines. "You are going to die," one warned. For months, these messages hung over the couple like a physical threat. But when the sheriff's department ran the fingerprints on the back of the adhesive tape, the truth was more tragic. The prints belonged to Karyn herself. In her apartment, investigators found the very magazines used to create the threats. It was a shattering revelation that Karyn had been stalking herself, creating a villain in order to force Andrew back into the role of her protector. She was casting herself in a tragedy of her own design, never realizing how close the real ending was. On the night of November 28th, the curtain finally fell. Earlier that evening, Karyn had shared a meal with friends, but by 9:30, she was back in her apartment with two other acquaintances. They watched television together, the glow of the screen the only light in the room as Karyn drifted in and out of a drug-induced lethargy. They left around 11:15, locking the door behind them. Andrew Prine was nearby, and later, he spoke to Karyn on the telephone around midnight. He told investigators it was a brief, unremarkable conversation. Because he was the last person known to speak to her, he became the primary focus of the law. He underwent hours of questioning and multiple polygraph tests, his every movement scrutinized by men who saw the broken script of their romance as a motive for a crime of passion. The investigators looked for a struggle, for a sign of a lover's rage that had finally boiled over. They found a knocked-over lamp and a trail of cigarettes, but the physical evidence against Andrew remained elusive. He maintained his innocence, and eventually, even Karyn's own father would state that he did not believe the young actor was responsible. But the damage to the narrative was done. The image of the bright-eyed actress was replaced by the image of a woman trapped in a cycle of obsession. The script of her life had been torn apart until only the most painful fragments remained. We must wonder about the pressure of those lights and the weight of the expectations. The story of Karyn and Andrew was a tragedy of two people lost in the shifting sands of Hollywood. Let the details of their love fade away like old film, flickering out in the dark. The search for a suspect had reached a standstill within the local precinct. But as the calendar turned away from that cold November, a new and darker possibility began to take root in the public imagination. November 1963 was a month of long shadows and a collective breath held tight. The country was reeling from the shots fired in Dealey Plaza, and the air was thick with a new, sharp kind of paranoia. In the quiet apartment on Sweetser Avenue, the silence felt different now. It was not just the silence of a life gone out. It was the silence of a world that had suddenly become much more dangerous. The television, which had been flickering for days before Karyn was found, likely carried the news of the president's passing into her living room while she was still alive. Or perhaps, as some would later whisper, she knew the news was coming before the first bullet ever left the chamber. For Karyn, the nightmare had a physical, suffocating weight that seemed to press against the very walls of her home, turning her sanctuary into a tomb. The timing was more than just a coincidence for those who looked at the world through a lens of hidden patterns. President John F. Kennedy had been assassinated on November 22nd. Karyn's body was discovered on November 30th. A mere 8 days separated these tragedies. In the grand tapestry of American history, those 8 days are a blur of mourning and confusion. But for Karyn Kupcinet, they represented the final, lonely countdown. Investigators were struggling with the physical evidence: the broken lamp, the cigarette butts, the lack of forced entry. But outside the room, a different kind of evidence was beginning to take shape. They looked at her father, Irv Kupcinet, a man whose reach in the world of media was vast, and they began to wonder if the secrets of the powerful had trickled down to his daughter in a way that proved fatal. The proximity of her death to the national grief suggested to some that she was not just a victim of a crime, but a witness to a conspiracy. One of the most haunting threads in this web began with a telephone operator in the small coastal city of Oxnard, California. It was said that 20 minutes before the shots rang out in Dallas, a woman's voice crackled over the line. The operator reported hearing a frantic, whispered warning. The voice claimed that the president was going to be killed. For years, the identity of that voice remained a ghost in the machine, a whisper in the static of history. But eventually, the name of Karyn Kupcinet began to surface in the margins of the investigation. The theory suggested that Karyn, through her connections in the high-stakes world of entertainment and politics, had overheard something she was never meant to hear. The operator described the caller as sounding disturbed and incoherent, rambling about the impending tragedy before the line suddenly went dead. Could a young actress in West Hollywood really have been the one trying to scream a warning to the world? Penn Jones Jr., a journalist obsessed with the casualties surrounding the Kennedy assassination, was the one who truly wove Karyn into this grand conspiracy. In his books titled Forgive My Grief, he listed Karyn as one of dozens of people who died under mysterious circumstances shortly after the events in Dallas. He painted a picture of a young woman caught in a net of intelligence officers, mobsters, and political fixers. The logic was cold. If Karyn knew of the plot, she was a loose end that needed to be tied. The strangulation, the lack of a suspect, and the confusing crime scene. In the eyes of the conspiracy theorists, these were not the marks of a domestic dispute, but the professional signature of a silencing. Jones even suggested her father knew Jack Ruby from their younger days in Chicago, creating a bridge of information that led directly to Karyn's door. It was a story of a daughter paying for the secrets of her father's world. Imagine the weight of such a secret if it were true. If we follow this path, we see Karyn not as a struggling actress, but as a witness to history in its most violent form. Her father's column was the heartbeat of Chicago, and his social circle included the very elite who moved the levers of power. Could a piece of information have slipped? Perhaps a drunken boast at a party, or a hushed conversation overheard in a dressing room. The apartment on Sweetser Avenue, with its soft pillows and discarded books, suddenly feels less like a home and more like a cage. The shadows on the walls shift from the play of streetlights to the silhouettes of men in gray suits, waiting for the right moment to step out of the dark. The tea she might have shared with a guest becomes a ritual of finality, and the silence of the room becomes the heavy, leaden silence of a cover-up in progress. There is a specific kind of dread in the idea that her death was a message. The anonymous tips that began to trickle into newsrooms weren't just about the murder. They were about the thick, suffocating atmosphere of 1963. Some callers spoke of seeing Karyn with men who did not belong in her world. Men who looked like they were carved from granite, with eyes that saw through the glitz of Hollywood. These tips were often dismissed by the Los Angeles Police Department as the ramblings of a public gripped by assassination fever, yet they persisted. They described a girl who was increasingly terrified in her final days, not of a boyfriend, but of a shadow she could not outrun. Her father, however, would later call these theories an atrocious outrage, a cruel exploitation of his daughter's tragic end that ignored the personal demons she was already fighting. He fought to keep her memory separate from the chaos of Dallas, but the public refused to let go of the link. We must look at the physical space again through this lens of conspiracy. The 2 coffee cups sitting on the table, the pack of cigarettes. If Karyn was hosting someone who came to silence her, the scene takes on a chilling civility. Did she sit across from her killer, discussing the very thing that would lead to her end? The lack of a struggle, except for that single knocked-over lamp, suggests a level of control that goes beyond a crime of passion. It suggests an execution. The theorists argue that the broken nature of the apartment was a clumsy attempt by professionals to make it look like a common robbery or a lover's spat, a distraction to keep the detectives from looking toward the secrets buried in the heart of the government. They saw the prescription bottles as a plant, a way to paint her as another unstable Hollywood tragedy. Every detail was scrutinized for a hidden meaning that might lead back to the grassy knoll. As we drift deeper into the fog of 1963, the lines between fact and folklore begin to dissolve. Was Karyn Kupcinet a victim of a cruel, personal fate, or was she a casualty of a national tragedy? The tangled web suggests that in that pivotal year, no one was truly an island. Every life was connected by invisible threads of power and consequence. The image of Karyn, young and hopeful, becomes inextricably linked to the motorcade in Dallas and the smoke of the rifle. The mystery does not just sit in a cold case file. It floats in the collective memory of an era where the truth was the first thing to be buried. We listen to the silence of her apartment, and we wonder if the wind rattling the window is just the weather or the echo of a warning that came too late. The light stays on in the hallway, but the room remains cold, forever haunted by the what-ifs of a world gone mad. The air inside apartment 201 was thick with more than just the scent of stagnant perfume and the residual warmth of a West Hollywood autumn. It held the invisible weight of a presence that had no name. When the investigators finally arrived in late November of 1963, their focus drifted across every polished surface, every mundane object that Karyn had touched in her final hours. They brought with them the tools of a slow and meticulous trade. Jars of fine carbon powder and brushes crafted from soft camel hair. In the deep stillness of the room, you could almost hear the bristles whisper as they danced against the cold glass of a windowpane or the grain of a side table. Every touch in a room leaves a ghost behind. Every finger that brushes a surface deposits a tiny, invisible map of oils and salt, a unique labyrinth of ridges that tells a secret story of who was there. In Karyn's sanctuary, these maps were everywhere, silent witnesses to a life of visitors and shadows. As the detectives worked, lifting the dark dust with strips of clear adhesive tape, a pattern began to emerge from the chaos. Many of the prints were easily identified. They belonged to her friends, to her boyfriend Andrew, and to the people who moved through her world of bright lights and scripted lines. But among the known patterns, there were the outliers. These were the phantom prints, the silent signatures of someone who should not have been there. Imagine the detective, hunched over in the dim light of the afternoon, carefully pressing the tape against a smudge on the refrigerator door or the handle of a porcelain cup. He lifts it away, and there, captured in black, is the physical evidence of a visitor who left no name. These prints were found in places that suggested a chilling familiarity, on a door handle, a glass, a surface near the couch where she was found. They were the physical echo of a shadow that had managed to slip through the door unnoticed. While the fingerprints sat in evidence folders, waiting for a match that might never come, a second mystery was taking shape outside on the street level. In the quiet hours of that November night, the neon of the Sunset Strip usually bled into the residential silence of the side streets. A neighbor in the apartment building, a man named David Lange who lived just below Karyn, became a focal point for the investigators. Lange was an actor, a man drifting through the fringes of the industry, and his movements that night were a tangle of contradictions. He claimed to have been out at the home of the famous Natalie Wood until 11:30, returning alone to his quiet rooms. Yet, stories began to circulate through the hallways of the Carlyle building. There were whispers of unusual activity, of footsteps that didn't match the rhythm of the usual residents, and a sighting of a figure moving with a purpose that felt wrong for the hour of 12:30 in the morning. The figure of the second man remains one of the most haunting elements of the case. Was he a stranger, a drifter drawn to the glamour of the building, or someone Karyn had willingly invited inside? The investigators pondered this as they flipped through thousands of fingerprint cards in the back rooms of the precinct. In an era before digital databases and instant searches, a fingerprint was only as useful as the person you already suspected. If the man was a shadow from the edge of the city, or someone whose name had never been typed into a file, he remained effectively invisible. The detectives even looked into the possibility of a link to other recent crimes, searching for a signature in the way the hyoid bone in the throat had been broken. It was a specific, brutal type of violence that required strength and a terrifying proximity. The phantom prints on the furniture seemed to pulse with the memory of that strength, yet they offered no names, only the cold promise of a secret kept. The investigation eventually took a heartbreaking turn when the lab results for the threatening notes came back. For weeks, Karyn and Andrew had been tormented by messages made of letters clipped from magazines, warning of death and loneliness. But when the technicians peeled back the tape on those notes, they found a fingerprint on the sticky underside. It was Karyn's. This discovery painted a picture of a young woman so desperate for connection, so drowning in the pressures of Hollywood, that she had authored her own terror to draw her loved ones closer. It was a tragedy of the mind, a cry for help hidden in a threat. However, this revelation did not explain the broken bone in her neck. It did not explain the unidentified prints on the glass. The fact that she had been fragile did not mean she hadn't been hunted. The presence of her own prints on the notes briefly distracted the police, but the physical reality of the crime scene remained. Someone had entered that apartment after her friends left at 11:15, and that someone had left marks that could not be accounted for. As the days turned into weeks and the year of 1963 drew to a close, the trail began to grow cold. David Lange eventually moved away, taking his lawyer's advice and his strange, dark jokes about the murder with him. The prints in the folders began to yellow at the edges, becoming static images of a single moment of contact. Think of the tactile nature of that evidence. The smudge of oil on a chrome handle, the way a person might have leaned against a wall while waiting for a reaction. The second man had become a symbol of the entire mystery, a figure standing just out of reach, blurred by the passage of time and the limitations of the era's science. The neighbors heard the floorboards groan, but footsteps are just vibrations in the wood. They saw a shape in the dark, but a shape has no heart. The unidentified prints remain the only tangible proof that a ghost walked those halls, yet they remain as silent and unyielding as the heavy night air of West Hollywood. The wind coming off Lake Michigan in the winter of 1963 carried a bite that seemed to seep through the very walls of the Kupcinet apartment. Inside, the world had slowed to a crawl. For Irv Kupcinet, a man whose life was measured in the frantic clicks of a typewriter and the bright flashbulbs of the Chicago social scene, the silence was now deafening. He was the city's premier gossip columnist, a man who knew everyone from presidents to barbers, yet in the wake of Karyn's death, he found himself a stranger in his own home. He would sit in his study, the air heavy with the scent of old ink and the faint, lingering aroma of the cigars he favored, staring at the telephone. For decades, that phone had been his weapon and his tool, the conduit through which he commanded the attention of the city. Now, it was a reminder of a call that had never come, the call that would tell him who had taken his daughter's life. Irv was not a man built for helplessness. In the months following the funeral at Temple Shalom, where 1,500 people had gathered under the weight of a collective, stunned grief, he began his own shadow investigation. He reached out to the highest levels of power, writing a personal plea to J. Edgar Hoover at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He asked for reinforcements, for the federal government to step in where the local detectives seemed to be faltering. But the reply he received was a cold, bureaucratic rejection. The Bureau claimed they had no jurisdiction. It was a local matter for the Los Angeles authorities. This was the first of many walls Irv would hit. He even turned to the shadows, contacting an attorney and fixer named Sidney Korshak to help navigate the complexities of the investigation. He was a father willing to walk into any room, no matter how dark, if it meant finding a name to attach to his daughter's killer. The psychological toll on the family was a slow-moving landslide. While Irv maintained a stoic, professional veneer for his readers, his wife Essie was beginning to fracture. She had once been the fire and light of his life, a woman who wore a blouse stenciled with his column's logo to show her pride. But after Karyn was gone, Essie became a ghost in her own residence. She began visiting the cemetery 5 times a week, standing over the cold ground as if she could pull her daughter back through sheer force of will. She sought out psychics and mediums, sending them Karyn's personal belongings in the desperate hope that a stranger could tap into the ether and find the truth. She began to lean on Jack Daniels and prescription pills to dull the jagged edges of her reality. For a year, Irv later described her as a zombie, moving through a world that no longer made sense. Their marriage, once a legendary partnership of Chicago royalty, became a shared space of quiet, mutual endurance. The most painful moment for Irv came during one of his many frustrated exchanges with the Los Angeles police. A high-ranking officer, perhaps weary of the columnist's relentless pressure, told him bluntly that his daughter was now just a statistic. To a man who had spent his life making people feel like they were the center of the universe, the idea that Karyn was merely a number in a dusty file was a betrayal he could never forgive. It fueled a quiet rage that he channeled into his work. In 1966, when he was offered a mind-boggling deal to move to California and take over the legendary Hedda Hopper's column, he refused. The offer included Hopper's office and her palatial home, but Irv couldn't bear the thought. He told his confidants that the memory was too fresh, and that Hollywood was a maelstrom that had sucked his daughter in and never let her go. He chose to stay in the Windy City, where the grief felt honest and the streets felt like home. As the years stretched into the 70s and 80s, the search for truth transformed into a quest for legacy. Since they could not find the man who killed her, they decided to build monuments to the life she should have lived. They established the Karyn Kupcinet International School for Science and a playhouse in her name. Essie threw her remaining energy into the Chicago Academy for the Arts, hoping to give other young people the opportunities that Karyn had sought in the treacherous hills of California. Every donation and every building was a brick laid against the forgetting. Yet, even as they built these honors, the case remained a cold, open wound. Irv would continue to receive tips and letters from the fringe, conspiracy theorists trying to link Karyn to the Kennedy assassination or anonymous voices claiming to have seen something that night on Sweetser Avenue. He investigated them all, never fully letting go of the hope that one day, a final piece of evidence would click into place. By the time the 90s arrived, Irv was an elder statesman of the press, still writing his column, but with a heart that had been partially frozen in 1963. He lived to see the turn of the millennium, passing away in 2003 at the age of 91. He died without the answer he had spent half his life seeking. To the very end, he remained a father in search of his daughter's peace. The files in the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department grew yellow and brittle, the ink fading on the statements of witnesses long since gone. The city of Chicago changed around him, the smoky clubs and neon-lit venues of his youth replaced by a modern skyline. But for Irv, the narrative always circled back to that Thanksgiving weekend. It was a story without a final chapter, a mystery that lived in the quiet pauses between his famous sentences. A father's love transformed into a lifelong vigil. Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Karyn Kupcinet murder. The years have a way of softening the sharp edges of a tragedy, turning the jagged glass of a crime scene into smooth, frosted pebbles of history. In the decades since that silent night in November of 1963, the trail has grown not just cold, but frozen in a layer of archival dust and unanswered questions. The apartment on Sweetser Avenue in West Hollywood is still there, but the echoes of the television that played to an empty room for 3 long days have long since faded into the hum of a modern city. We find ourselves now at the final stage of our journey, looking back at a young woman who was a rising star. To understand the cold weight of this case today, one must look at the physical remnants that remain in the files of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. There is a photograph of a couch, and upon it, a young woman who looks as though she has simply fallen into a deep, dreamless sleep. But the science of the time told a more violent story. The coroner, a man named Dr. Harold Cade, pointed to a single, devastating detail: a broken hyoid bone in her throat. This tiny bone is a silent witness to pressure, a marker of a life stolen by manual strangulation. Yet, even this fact is shrouded in doubt. Some later whispered that the doctor might have caused the break himself during the examination. This doubt created a crack in the foundation that would never be repaired. As the 1960s became the 70s, and then the 80s, the name Karyn Kupcinet stayed alive through the tireless efforts of her father, Irv. In the newsrooms of Chicago, where the clatter of typewriters and the smell of fresh ink defined the era, Irv Kupcinet was a titan. He was a man who knew everyone from presidents to kings, yet he could not find the one person who had entered his daughter's home and changed his world forever. He lived for 40 years after her death, a long span of time spent in the public eye while carrying a private, heavy grief. Beside him was Essie, her mother, who carried the same weight. He saw the conspiracy theories bloom like weeds, the strange claims that Karyn had tried to warn the world. There were suspects, of course, whose names are now etched into the ledger of the unsolved. There was the boyfriend, Andrew Prine, whose complicated relationship with Karyn was marked by anonymous notes and a stalking that revealed the cracks in her own peace. There was the neighbor, David Lange, a man who allegedly joked about the killing in a haze of alcohol, only to recant and fade into the background. And then there were the theories suggested by writers who wondered if there was no killer at all. They proposed a different kind of tragedy. A young woman, perhaps influenced by the 80 prescription pills she had taken that week, dancing alone in her apartment to free her inhibitions, only to fall against the edge of a coffee table and strike her throat. It was a lonely end. Today, the justice we seek for Karyn is not found in a courtroom. It is found in the way her family chose to remember her. They turned their pain into a legacy of learning and art. The Karyn Kupcinet International School for Science and the performing arts centers that bear her name are monuments to a life that was meant to be long and vibrant. In these halls, the name Cookie is not synonymous with a cold case, but with the pursuit of truth and the advancement of human knowledge. The mystery of who was in that apartment on that late November night remains locked in the past, a secret kept by the four walls of a West Hollywood flat and the passing of decades. We are left only with the image of a girl who moved too quickly across the stage of life, leaving us with a story that has no final chapter, but only a lingering, soft, and quiet memory. As we look at the legacy, we see a father who never stopped loving and a mother who never stopped grieving, and a sister who was lost to the shadows of Hollywood. The story is a tapestry of what could have been. As we let the city of Los Angeles fade into the distance, we recognize that some midnights never truly see the dawn. The case of Karyn Kupcinet remains a ghost in the machine of history, a reminder of a time when the world was changing and a young life was caught in the gears. We hold her memory gently now, allowing the questions to dissolve into the stillness of the night. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.